Unfound is brought to you by its supporters at Patreon, PayPal, and YouTube, along with its gracious advertisers. Judith Anne Brown was a 19-year-old from New York City, New York. She was a friendly, popular girl who was a psych major. In mid-April 1977, Judy seemingly took off with a man she met while they were in a mental health facility together. She was never seen again. But he might have been. I'm Ed Denzel, and this is Unfound. I've been talking for a while about a particular type of disappearance that Unfound has not yet covered. And I think the reason I've mentioned it so often is because I've been really ready to cover one. What is it? Somebody who is really bad, who is on the run from the law. To be sure, I'm not talking about Judith, but more on that in a moment. Sure, we've discussed some people who were evading the law when they disappeared. Some of those disappearances are Brennan Smokey, Crystal Bailey, and very recently Matthew Braswell, and a bunch of others who, had they been found, they would have gone straight to jail. Sure, they were felons, but I'm not so sure how scary any of them were. Whereas the kind of disappearance I've been longing to cover would be one of a hardcore criminal who did something really horrible. Well, with the disappearance of Judy Brown, she is not that person. In fact, Judy was the exact opposite. Yet, yep, she really did it. She dared to escape with a killer. And now a summary of the case. Neither of these disappearances is on my friend Megan Linez's website, charlieproject.org, but Judy's is on NAMUS. Judy Brown grew up in a large family in New York City, and this was the plan, to always live there. However, things changed in seconds when Judy's father got hit by a car while walking. Once he became well, Judy's parents and siblings, all except Judy, moved to Kansas because she wanted to stay in the Big Apple. However, this started a downward spiral for Judy, in which she eventually had to be admitted to a mental health facility in the mid-1970s. However, at the time of her disappearance, Judy was enrolled in college classes and had met a man, Richard, and they got engaged. So, in mid-April 1977, Judy had gone to visit a couple of other family members still in New York City. Yet after this, Judy could not be found at the facility where she was supposed to be every night to fulfill an agreement there. When Judy did not show up by the end of April 1977, management threw her stuff out. Yet, by this time, somehow Judy's family discovered that she had already taken off with Richard, who was also AWOL from the facility where he was supposed to check in every night. The two were never seen again. Only then did Judy's family find out who Richard actually was and how dangerous he could be. Although Judy is the main person for this episode, Richard's history and subsequent events might be a better avenue of investigation for trying to figure out what happened to both of them. See if you agree as you try to answer these three questions during the interview. Number 1, was Judy abducted, or did she go willingly, maybe even planning this herself? Number 2, since Judy has not been heard from since April 1977, is Richard harming her the most likely scenario? And number 3, did Richard really call his lawyer around the year of 1995, or was it a scammer, or is the lawyer making it all up? Judy's family's theories center on the fact that she disappeared with a murderer. The guest for this episode is Judy's cousin, Julian Quaterio. Unfound News. This coming Thursday, March 23rd at 7 p.m., I will be appearing live with Dr. Telesco again on her show on the Fischler College of Education and School of Criminal Justice YouTube channel. We'll be discussing a disappearance in which the solution was only 1 mile from the Nova Southeastern University campus. Next, I continue to work on my upcoming teachable course, How to Podcast Better Than Anyone. Please start looking for ads and notices as to when it will be available. Finally, Dad is here. He's 86 years old, and he drove the whole way from Pennsylvania. How long will he be here? I don't know. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the cousin of Judy Brown, Julian Quaterio. Julian, welcome to Unfound.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me on.
Let's start here. Of course, there are 2 people missing in this disappearance, but you are only a relative of one of them, and we certainly want to make sure that we concentrate on Judy in this disappearance, but we're going to have to talk about Richard too. But let's talk about you first. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, maybe the kind of work that you do, things like that. What do the people, the audience, need to know about Julian Quaterio?
Sure. I'm from New York City. I became a private investigator in 2012, and I only worked in the private, sector for like a year, and then I went over to public defenders, and I have been a public defense investigator for the last 10 years.
Wow.
So I've been investigating in New York City for about 11 years now. I'm not law enforcement, but I've just been working on over time. I've worked in a lot of different types of cases, and but never anything like this. I guess I could say, because we don't really do these kind of cases.
Right. Sure. So you are licensed in the state of New York?
No, but in New York State you don't have to be licensed to be an investigator.
Okay, to doing what you're doing. So you work for a public defender's office in New York City for what? What county, if you can say?
Brooklyn.
Brooklyn. You're from this Brooklyn. Very good. Thank you. Okay. Maybe we need to go back a little farther than that. What got you into that, Julian?
It's really strange. I went to college. I thought I knew what I wanted to do. I ended up having changed my major 3 times, and none of it was ever criminal justice. And when I started at the private, the PI firm in Queens, I just took to it. I just really liked the work, and I had never done anything like it before. And at the time, I really didn't know what career path I had wanted to go down, and I just stumbled upon this. And this is many years after I graduated.
Right.
Yeah. So hindsight's 20/20. I kind of wish I could go back and do all criminal justice.
Yeah. Me too. Right.
But I really enjoyed it, and then once I moved on to, investigations that were for the city, misdemeanors, felonies, and stuff like that, I really just liked all the aspects of it in terms of, interviewing witnesses, getting statements, taking photos, and getting video of different crime scenes and stuff like that. So,
yeah.
I really enjoyed it, and I stayed with it, and, still to this day, and then, I don't know, and then I also kind of started doing some of this, missing person stuff on the side. I kind of fell into it.
Okay, very good. Now, maybe I should ask you, what were you doing before you started into this investigation stuff? And I ask you this, if you don't know, I have a very diverse background. I've been a car salesman. I was a printer and fax machine technician. I was a stage manager for some Vegas shows. I mean, I have a very, very diverse background that, you know, really has nothing to do with me doing this podcast for the 6.5 years. Maybe you can, do you have such a diverse occupational background as well before you got into investigating?
Yeah. I mean, when I was in college, I studied archaeology, so I was very set on, you know, just becoming a professor, doing archaeology, and I loved it. But, you know, I guess when I think about it now, it's like, you know, trying to put together the pieces and mysteries of the ancient world versus the modern world.
That's right. That's, you know, man, that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
And, you know, and it was in the anthropology department. But as soon as I was starting to like graduate and leave school, I just realized that my major, the lifestyle I would have had as an archaeologist was not what I wanted. You know, I loved the profession, but I didn't like love the kind of work that I would be, I want to say forced to do, but the lifestyle I would be forced to have.
Yeah.
You know, so I wanted something more that would keep me here, like in the States, you know, maybe in New York, you know, and I could work here and you know, be here.
Right. Right. Yeah, we all had visions of being Indiana Jones at one time or another, Julian, I suppose, right?
Yeah. I mean, I had been on the dig before, and that was amazing. And then after that, I had worked in the mobile industry for about 5 years. I worked for Sprint and AT&T.
Okay.
And so I got used to kind of, it was around the 2006 period of time, you know, so it was like right when the first iPhones were coming out. And, you know, so I got very familiar with technology as well. I mean, so I'm very comfortable with tech now when I have to use it for my investigations, you know, videos and all those kind of things, you know.
Sure. Okay. Let's move on to this. How are you related to Judy Brown?
My mother is Judy's first cousin.
Okay.
They grew up together, like, you know, different parts of New York. So technically I'm her cousin once removed, but in my family, like, we're just cousins.
Yeah.
Like, I grew up knowing her oldest sister, you know, and I was a child, you know, and her sister's, you know, a little bit older, much older than me.
Right.
So, yeah, she knew me since I was a baby, and she was always, you know, my cousin, you know, and all her siblings as well. It's just a lot of, aside from that one sister, you know, all of the rest of Judy's siblings, you know, she was one of 8. They all lived in different parts of the country. So there's some of them I have not seen for 20, 25 years, maybe more.
Okay.
You know, so that was an interesting family dynamic, you know, is that I would see one cousin, like, very, you know, at family functions, and the other ones, like, some of them, 1 or 2 of them I've never even met.
Right. Big family. Okay, so that is how you were related. And we're going to get into how you got off. Of course, we already know that your everyday job is investigating, helping a public defender's office. But we'll get back to how you first started getting into Judy's disappearance here a little later. Once we go talk a little bit about her and the circumstances and everything else. So we'll bring it up to the 21st century and when you decided you were going to do this. So let's move on to this. Of course, you did not know Judy one-on-one, but what have people told you about her? Being that many of your older family members did know her, you've spoken to some of them, your mother, etc. What did they say just about Judy in general? Personality, things like that. What was she doing with her life in like the early 70s? What would they say about her? Popular, introverted, things like that.
Judy was very, very straight-laced, I would call it. She had her own social circles growing up, and she was social, but I wouldn't call her an extrovert. She was more of a quiet type that had a good number of friends.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and she used to do things and hang out with other kids in the neighborhood, depending on like what neighborhood she lived in. I mean, she lived in the Bronx for a while. She lived in Queens for a while, and so I hate to make it sound so regular, but you know, she was just I feel like a typical, you know, kid that wasn't into anything that was I don't know, like
mm-hmm.
she just like I said, she just went to school. She got pretty good grades. She was quiet. She hung out with her friends. She never got in trouble with the police or anything like that. You know, I mean, she didn't even smoke cigarettes. You know, like,
all right, so pretty straight-laced, I guess. Nothing that in her behavior would have ever led anybody to believe that she would go missing and still be missing all these years later, I guess was what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there were aspects of her as she started to grow up and her family situation that I think shaped her slowly into, you know, the teenager and young woman that she became. I mean, it's actually, when I thought about it, it's a little strange to try to, you know, to describe somebody who we only know up until 19 years old.
Right, know what I mean? That's true. That's true.
You know,
great point.
I mean, and she, you know, she had graduated high school in June of 75.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then roughly about 2 years later, she, you know,
she goes missing.
She goes missing. Yeah.
Right, and I don't, you know, it's none of my business how old you are, Julian, but certainly the person I was at 19 is different than the person I am at 52, and certainly even different than the person I was at 30. So yes, we have to remember she was just 19 when she went missing, and you know, we have to just remember that. Not a full-fledged adult yet, you know, with you know, making a lot of, you know, big decisions in her life. That's a very good point. But everybody seemed to like Judy, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, there are some, you know, personal circumstances of hers that, you know, if you want me to get into.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a moment. Yeah, we'll get into that in a moment. But I'm just saying that she's just a good person.
Yeah, you know, nobody really had an issue with her, and
mm-hmm.
I actually don't think she had a boyfriend before she disappeared. You know. Well,
okay. Except for Richard, who we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Now I do have to ask you about this though. It sounds to me like most of your family, even to this day, is centered there in New York City. We know how it's the largest city in the United States. But what was it, your understanding? And once again, if you don't know, but if you know, I think this is, you know, could play a role in this disappearance. Why was it that some of her family, you know, specifically connected to her, moved to Kansas? What, do you any insight into that? And when did that happen?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a sad story. You know, her father, you know, my great uncle, he was hit by a drunk driver as a pedestrian.
Wow.
One night, and it was a very awful accident. And I guess he was thrown into a tree, like after the car hit him.
Yeah.
And he had a very intense traumatic brain injury, and he wasn't able to work, and he was disabled after that, and that really affected their ability to, I guess, financially remain stable, you know. And since, you know, she was one of 8, you know, they had a lot of, I guess, a lot of mouths to feed,
for sure. A lot of
expenses. And I think it just after they hung on for, I mean, because I think that happened to him at 65, and so they hung on for a number of years as long as they could. But then what changed in 75 is that I believe his father passed away and left him a farm in Kansas, and I think they just said to themselves, you know what, this is a lot more feasible than the kind of life that we're living here in New York, like, you know, struggling to, you know, I think a lot of people here in New York could identify with that, you know, either, you know, you're either struggling, you know, paycheck to paycheck,
right,
or great, you know.
Or you're living in an apartment overlooking Central Park, one of the two, right?
Yeah. And my, you know, her family was the former.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess they just wanted to, you know, try, I guess try to go with what made sense, since they had that property and nobody was going to be living on it, so they moved up to Kansas.
So why didn't your understanding? Once again, I realize you were not there at the time. What is your understanding why Judith didn't go with them?
Oh well, I think it'd be the same reason why anybody would want. I mean, she they were going to Coldwater, Kansas, and when I looked it up, and it's an extremely rural place. It's not just like a little bit rural. I mean, it's very different from the lifestyle that she grew up with.
Okay.
So that was one of the major factors. Just kind of like that's just not what she wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, because her mother was working and her father couldn't, I think she was doing a lot of childcare for her younger siblings.
Yeah.
Because she was out of the 8, she was the third child, and then there were 5 younger than her.
Yeah.
So she was helping with 5 various children, and I'm one of 4, and I'm the oldest.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand the frustration of having 3 younger siblings and having to be babysitter sometimes.
Yes.
You're like free labor.
Right. Yeah, you're right. No, Julian, you got it right. You're right. And so maybe so I guess what you're saying here is they're moving to Kansas, and Judith maybe thought, this is my chance to get out from being a parent. I can have my own life now, and they'll have to take care of my younger siblings, not me.
Yeah. And
possible.
She wanted to go to college, and she had already enrolled by the time they were moving. So I don't think she wanted to change that either.
Sure.
She was undergrad for psychology, and she had actually I have a bunch of letters that she wrote back in the time of 76, and she says, I'm taking psychology because I want to be able to address some of my mental health issues and understand myself better,
Right.
And
right.
So she also wanted, I think, to be closer to what New York's resources had available to her, like if she needed, therapists or psychiatrists to be able to help her with whatever mental health issues she may have been struggling with.
Right. We're gonna get into that in a moment. I guess what we're also saying is, your average 19-year-old, would they rather, even in the 21st century, would the average 19-year-old live out in the middle of nowhere, Kansas? I have nothing against people. I grew up in the country in Pennsylvania, and it was perfectly fine. But given the choice between out in the middle of nowhere in Kansas or in New York City, especially if you grew up there, I think most children would pick New York City, right?
Yeah.
Not an unusual choice.
I think going from one extreme to the other for either side is just very intimidating.
Yeah. You're right.
Because I know plenty of people who are like, I'm out here in the quietness, and I could never live in the city.
Yes.
I'm like, hey, that's cool.
That's right. Okay. So you've talked about, let's move on to this, being that you've brought it up, that sets this up very nicely. Her mental health, what was going on with her? Once again, you as best as you can tell, you were not there. What have other people told you? What is your understanding as the kind of issues that she was having? And I just have in the outline, was she depressed, suicidal, delusional, bipolar? What was going on with her in the early 70s?
After her family dynamic changed and her father's accident, I think on one hand it was very hard for anybody to see their family member that they're living with, so dramatically changed after such an accident.
Yeah.
Not only was he, mentally changed because he had a traumatic brain injury, but he was also he was disfigured in a way.
Yeah.
And so he probably looked very different. He's lucky that he was even alive,
Right.
And so I think that impacted her a lot. And she started to slowly exhibit signs of depression. And just some, some other behaviors that people would think would fall in. I'm not a doctor, so I can't diagnose her, but fall into certain mental health. like she did struggle, I think, with anorexia, I've been told.
Okay.
And then the depression, and and with depression, I know from personal experience, it comes anxiety. There's like an anxiety portion to it.
Yep.
And so I think she just was having a hard time managing that, and then after her two older siblings moved out, and went on to do whatever they were doing with their lives, and a lot of those responsibilities were falling on her. Like that family pressure combined with what she was struggling with already was just starting to, like, chip away. I think chip away at her. In some way, like it just like the stressors that she had were seemed to be pretty intense for her.
Did she end up admitting herself? And this is where Richard's going to come into this eventually. But did she admit herself to a hospital, or did somebody admit her? Saying, "Hey, Judith, I think we got to do this." What is your understanding?
Well, the first time she was admitted to a hospital was after her family was already in Kansas in '76. She was in college, in one of her psych classes, and I don't know how, nobody knows how, but she had some sort of panic attack or breakdown in class, and one of my aunts went to go to the school they called her because, she was the emergency number. So she went to the school, to see what was going on, and, my aunt was a nurse, and so she said, well, let's take you to a hospital, and Judy was willing. Like, it wasn't like anybody had to convince her or drag her to a hospital, so one of the professors was really nice and offered to drive them to the nearest hospital, and at the time they were having trouble figuring out where to go. This is how it kind of plays into the story. The first hospital they go to, there's a hospital strike. The second hospital they get to is Creedmoor Psychiatric Facility. Mm-hmm. And since my was a nurse, she knew the reputations of all these hospitals in the area. And she said to Judy, no, like, don't check yourself into there. Like, let's just go on to the next hospital, which was Hillside, and let's have Judy checked in there. But the problem is none of them knew the directions. This just goes to show you the difference between then and now. Mm-hmm. So the professor was getting kind of tired, and he was just like, listen, like, I don't really want to be driving around, so can we just, like, leave her here? And Judy was like, it's okay. I'm just gonna stay here. So she checked herself into Creedmoor on August 3rd of 1976.
Okay, and how did things get? Your understanding, how did things go there? Did she work herself out of it, or what happened?
What happened is immediately, the cousin that had taken her, to the hospital with the professor, went home and, told her parents, because Judy was staying with my side of the family at the time. Her aunt and uncle, my grandmother and grandfather. Mm-hmm. So Judy was staying with her aunt and uncle while her family had moved away, and, all of, like, my mom and all of her siblings lived in the house as well. And so my grandmother and grandfather went to Creedmoor, maybe the 4th or the 5th, to pick her up and transfer her to the other hospital that they wanted to put her in originally, because they just thought it was a better fit for her. So she was only really in that Creedmoor facility for about 24 to 48 hours.
That's it.
It wasn't long at all. And then she was a voluntary inpatient at Hillside after that for like 3 or 4 months.
Okay. All right. So she goes to Creedmoor first, and then she goes to this, I guess, place that was perceived to be better later. And so, and once again, was this a situation where she was actually, was she actually getting better? Was she getting help? Or did this seem like something that was, persistent? What do you think?
She was writing letters to my family at the time while she was, inpatient. The way the letters sound, she sounds positive, and, obviously, the reality of it could be really different. But, you know, she doesn't sound particularly negative about anything. So I think being there did help her address some of her issues. I mean, I know that after some point, you know, she was prescribed some medication. I don't know what kind. You know, and I'm sure that helped her a bit as well. So it was like a combination of, like, you know, therapy, psychiatry, and just an opportunity to kind of maybe de-stress from all the other pressures that she had
going
around
on.
her, like,
okay.
Classes. Yeah.
Right. So what was then her living situation in 1976 into 1977? Because this is going to play into a little bit later because of, you know, my understanding she was under some situation, you know, that had something to do with the care that she was getting or a hospital that she was getting. What situation was this?
Well, after her parents left, she lived with my grandmother grandfather for about a year until 76. And then after she had that episode and went into the hospital, inpatient, and came out of the hospital, I want to say December of 76 or like early December.
Okay.
She was transferred into an outpatient program that Hillside Hospital that provided housing. And, you know, when I learned this, I've never heard anything like that, like, you know, to this day. So I was very shocked that they had housing. And so a part of their housing agreement was that she would attend my group therapy sessions and still continue with all of her therapy and her medication, and they would provide housing for her, like, I guess until she decided she wanted to move out, or she could, you know, get a job that could pay for what she wanted to do. So I think at that point, the world was open to her, you know, and they were just trying to, like, kind of support that, like, okay, you know, we'll provide you with housing while you're trying to get better, and then afterwards you can decide what you want to do.
Right. So this housing was based on the fact that she would continue to get help for the situation that she was in, mental situation that she was in, and if she were, for example, this is just an example, not show up for therapy or stop taking her medication or anything like that, that she would then be booted out of this program for the housing?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know after how long, but that was the agreement.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Was she, of course, given the situation, as best as you can tell, what was she doing for money at this point? Of course, we know New York City, not a cheap place to live. What was she doing for money at the time? Do you know?
I guess the short answer is no.
You don't know?
Okay. Yeah, I know that her family wasn't sending her money because they were still trying to get themselves on their feet in Kansas. And, you know, I don't know how she was getting money, but I do know that, you know, she didn't have to worry about paying for housing at the time.
Right.
They probably did provide her with some meals of some sort. So I guess whatever she wanted, you know, whatever she wants herself to pay for, like, she'd have to somehow come up with. But I don't really have any idea.
Okay.
Where she gotten that money from.
Okay, so we might be open to the idea that she was waitressing or something.
Yeah, it's possible.
Okay.
But no one in my family has ever mentioned that she was working when she was outpatient, but it's possible she might have been doing some gig on the side that, you know, made her some quick money. Okay,
thank you. Let's now talk about Richard Riesenberg. We're just going to talk about in general terms. His last name is Riesenberg. He is still missing. But how did he and Judith originally meet?
I'll call it the perfect storm of bad circumstances.
Okay.
When Judy went to Creedmoor on August 3rd of 76, Richard was already checked into that facility. Okay. And sometime between, you know, the time that she checked in, you know, on the 3rd and leaving sometime on the 4th or 5th, they had already talked enough that they either became friends or started to kind of become interested in each other in a very short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Enough that even though she left to go to another facility for months and months and months, they were able to reconnect after she got back out.
Okay.
I'm sure they had access to phones in the hospital that maybe they could call and talk to one another.
Yeah.
And I think I know she was inpatient. She wasn't really allowed to leave. Otherwise, she would be kind of, she wouldn't be she would be violating her program. So she had to stay inpatient if she wanted their help. But Richard, was able to, I think, visit her sometimes. So that's the only way I believe they could have seen each other between like August and her getting out in December.
Okay. I guess what we're saying here, going back to what you said earlier, and that was a nice setup by you, Julian, is had your family gotten what they wanted to take it to this other hospital first, Richard and Judith would have never met.
No. They would never have met.
Wow. Okay. Now, was this to a point, once again, your understanding that she and Richard were like a couple, with this outpatient program, you're probably going to have to explain this. Could they, if they were a couple, could they go on dates? Did she ever introduce him to anybody, somewhere, anything like that?
By December, they definitely were a couple, and I don't know how quickly things moved because I'm assuming that they between August and December they were able to communicate somehow at the least, because their relationship after in December starts to kind of like escalate very quickly in a positive way. She's really falling in love with him. He's treating her very well. When you asked me before about money and expenses.
Yeah.
Once she got out and she was dating him, I think he might have been able to pay for a lot of her things.
Sure. Okay.
And because of the situation he was in, and
right.
Then they had been together, and she went to visit her family one last time in Kansas for Christmas.
Okay.
And after she came back, she had written a letter to her mother saying that she and Richard were engaged, and that was in January.
In January of 77.
Yeah.
Wow, okay. So they meet in this, he's in there, and we'll get into the reasons he was in there. But they meet there, then she gets to this other hospital. They keep in touch, kind of become a couple. And then she goes to meet her family, but when she comes back, soon after that, she writes a letter saying she and Richard, who was older than 19, we'll just leave it at that, they are a couple, they are engaged, and the way you understand it, what was your family's response at that time, knowing that Judith was engaged to a guy she met while she was in this Creedmoor hospital who's allegedly was having issues like she was? What was your family response to all that? Do you even know?
I don't believe Judy was very clear about that he was in the hospital as well.
Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha.
There are, like I said, there were a bunch of letters of her writing to her family at the time, and how she says she met Richard is at a bus stop.
Oh, okay. All right. Gotcha.
Yeah, kind of near outside of the facility somewhere. But I ran into this guy out at the bus stop, and it just it doesn't really work, in that period because she was inpatient, for 1 or 2 days, and then she moved on,
Yeah. So what you're saying is she it wasn't clear how she met him. She was telling people she met him at the bus stop, and that's not how they met.
No.
Okay. All right. Okay. I maybe understand that. Of course, she could not know what was going to happen later, and maybe that was just a little white lie at the time that maybe came back, to haunt her later. But I have it in my notes. There is though a letter I think maybe this is the last letter that she wrote before she went missing. Was it from April 4th of 1977? And I have it in my notes, so it must be noteworthy. What did it say? What was this?
That's the strange part about it is that the letter on the 4th was not, it didn't have anything specific about it that was even as significant as, oh, I'm engaged now.
Huh.
It seemed to be a very normal, plain letter that had no indication that she had any plans to go anywhere or do anything, or that anything was really changing. So that letter in and of itself was not very. It wasn't very useful in terms of saying anything, except that she was just, kind of keeping things low key, even if they might not have been.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe I should ask you this then. If there were any letters written, of course, we said early January, she writes a letter saying she and Richard are engaged. We know that she goes missing in April, so that's at least 3 months. Were there any other letters between that time talking more about Richard and being engaged? Any talk about them getting married sometime in 1977? Anything like that?
There were letters in between, and at some point, I don't know how or when, it was March, or it's the March, April time of 77. She writes a letter to her mother that's basically saying, I know now that you know that Richard's in the hospital, and and I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry,
right.
but trust me, I know what I'm doing, and I'm confident that things will work out for the best.
Okay.
And she seemed pretty confident of that. So at some point, either she told, my family or someone found out, but then it became clear that she had met him at the hospital. But from their perspective, if he was having some issues like she was, I guess.
Right. I guess what we're saying also, just to cut right to this, her family, maybe not even Judith herself, knew the real Richard, possibly, right?
My family definitely didn't.
Yeah, never knew it, and maybe Judith didn't either.
No, I can't. Maybe I can't even. I don't know what she knew.
Right.
Or what he told her.
Got it. Okay, just to make sure, because we're going to get to that in a moment. But in that, just the way you understand it, that last letter from April 4th, was Richard mentioned in it?
Yeah, she mentions him in a couple of letters.
Okay.
Very amicably, very, positive, sweet letters. Oh, Richard's sitting here next to me while I'm writing. He says hello. But nobody had ever met him.
Yeah.
And and one of her sisters finally met him around early April. And what was strange is I had always thought that maybe they went out to eat or something. They went to have lunch, because Judy is outpatient and Richard could come and go sometimes. And it turns out that she had actually brought her sister to Creedmoor to meet him there, and I guess they hung out at the hospital for a couple of hours, and I thought that was very. I don't know. It's an interesting way to introduce your family to your fiance.
I agree with you, Julian. I agree with you, and this is coming from a guy who's been single his whole life. Even that is unique. Even though I know nothing about such things personally, I agree with you. Okay, so really, 1977, she's engaged to this Richard Riesenberg. She's getting her therapy. She's living there. She's writing these letters very, frequently, keeping in touch with her family in Kansas, which every good daughter should do. So when was it, in April late of 1977, how was it first noticed, if you know, that Judith was missing? How did that all come about? Did somebody, who was it that finally said, this Judy Brown person, we haven't seen her for a while. What do you know about that, Julian?
Well, I know that in terms of the timeline, I've been with other family members. I've been kind of able to figure refine it more than it originally was. Like, for instance, on
Great.
NAMUS, it says she disappeared as of the 6th, and I know that's not true.
Okay.
You know, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that, like, I would correct that if I could, but you know, I've been obviously told I'm not law enforcement, so they would have to do it. But you know, I know that on the 4th, that day that she wrote that letter, the last letter, she went to go visit a family member of mine in a different hospital for a different reason. You know, because one of my other family members had an issue, and you know, so she was in the hospital, so Judy went to visit her there, and then she came back again on the 13th and went to visit again my family member in the hospital. You know, and you know, Name says she went missing on the 6th, but on the 13th she's at the hospital visiting, you know, one of my aunts.
Yep.
It honestly doesn't make any sense.
Does not make any sense. I agree with you.
And how I was able to figure that out was, you know, I discovered that, you know, some of my family members kept records and diaries of these things. You know, and you know, I don't know how much people will use diary as an evidence, but I mean, I'm sure people don't lie in their own diaries. Like, I don't think, you know. So it's very, you know, not knowing that a lot of these things had existed over time. Like, once I was like, you have a diary? Like, you know, I was like, oh my gosh, that's perfect. You know, it was like a timeline dream for me.
Yeah.
And, you know, and so the 13th, she's still around. And then by the 26th, you know, one of my aunts is writing in her diary that, like, Judy's already gone with Richard. It's the 26th.
So less than 2 weeks. So she's going there the 13th to go and see this family member in the hospital. Then less than 2 weeks later, somebody's already writing in their journal, we think Judy's gone.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Richard also, like, he had a date in the newspaper that says that when he went missing. So I'm guessing that they're probably the same date.
Probably. Yeah, of course we didn't know it, and we're going to get to how the people put that all together. But as far as who was it, though, that, you know, how could this family member even write in her journal in the 26th to even know that she was gone? Did Judy call her and tell her, hey, I'm taking off, or do we even know that?
No, it just kind of, I think it became common knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how. I would say this, that if Judy was not showing up to her housing, you know, again, she might have had emergency contact, and maybe, you know, that might have been how my family, you know, was aware. Like, oh, is she coming back? What's going on? You know, that's the only thing I could really think of, because, you know, it was harder to communicate back in the 70s, and you had something specifically set up. And I think because she was part of a program, she would have those emergency contacts in place.
Yeah. So going back, and the reason we established this early on is because she was living at this place. Because she took off, she actually ended up getting kicked out of that place at the end of April of '77, correct? Because she wasn't fulfilling her obligation.
Yeah, and I actually have one of the letters that my family member saved from April 28th, like when they officially terminated her housing.
Okay. All right. So she just goes missing. She's not showing up for whatever she was supposed to be doing to fulfill this obligation to stay there. And she's not there on the 28th. And they essentially just kick her out. Now, some questions for you. Did anybody, once again, I know you've been working on this. I know you're going to continue to work on this. But at this point, have you ever been able to find anybody who actually saw her leave on any date? April 14th, April 20th, anything? I guess what I'm asking you is anybody who we trust, besides Richard, anybody who says, yeah, I think I was the last person to see Judith.
I think law enforcement was able to confirm that she was seen at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Not anybody that I know on my side, but there were confirmations, you know, I guess in the newspaper, or also at the time she was living in those apartments, she had 2 roommates. So if she went missing and somebody went to go question the roommates, I mean, the roommates could have said the last time they saw her.
Yeah. I guess what I'm asking you is, as an example, nobody actually saw Richard Riesenberg pull up in a Corvette and she jumped in with him and they took off. Nobody, that's an example. Nobody actually saw anything like that.
Not that I know of.
Yeah, not that you've been able to find out.
Yeah, there might be record of it, but I don't have access.
Okay, all right. But I know you've been talking to a lot of people, but you've not run across that yet.
No.
Okay, very good. To your knowledge, was anybody able to, at the time, determine if she took anything with her? For example, her clothes, her purse. Did she leave everything behind? What is your impression of that?
She packed a bag. It seemed like some sort of luggage, and she did take a substantial amount of stuff with her. I don't think she took everything. Just whatever she thought she could use. Wherever she was going, and she did make a final trip also back to my grandmother's house one last time to check if she had left anything there as well. And I think that was on the 13th when she went to the hospital.
Oh, okay.
Part of that was to check to see if she had anything she wanted to take with her, at that point, because after that, it's a little convenient that a week before she goes missing, she comes to the house, she picks up some stuff.
Right.
And then, and then she leaves.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think that's some good insight. So it very well, I guess what we're saying here is there could have been some sort of plan in place. It wasn't like she just woke up one day and she and Richard decided they were going to take off. There might be signs here, evidence that this was pre-planned even a week in advance.
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, and so I'm guessing also, being that we're talking about this, no signs of violence or anything at the place that she was staying. Anything broken, any, drawers on the floor, anything like that, to your knowledge?
No foul play that anybody has reported and that I ever heard.
Okay.
So, everything seemed just
okay.
Indicate some sort of voluntary,
and it does sound like it was voluntary, even though she might not have known what she was getting into. All right, let's go back to talking about you, Julian. When did you decide in your life, to start working on this? Maybe as a child, when did you first hear that you had this cousin who went missing back in the 1970s? Is that even a moment that registers at this point, or does it seem like you just always known it? What can you say?
I mean, that's the kind of thing, I've always had a pretty good memory, and especially for things like that. And, when I was younger, I think at some point, whenever you're talking to your family members, they'll just give you random, anecdotes and stories and things. And, sometimes, you're like, oh, where did that come from? But I remember in my early teens, my mother had brought it up to me that she had a cousin that was missing. And I guess at that age, I was like, what? Being naive and 13, 14 years old, something like that, that happens in real life.
Yeah, right.
And it happened in our family. And, since I had never met Judy, it was like one of those things that, of course I believed her, but it was so foreign to me, and I just asked her, what happened, and my mom really didn't know that much. She just said she decided to leave, and she left with some guy, and she never came back, and it's been decades. And I was like, oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then, it kind of stuck in my mind over the years. I mean, I obviously was not able to do much about it as, 20, 25. But then once I started getting into investigations in my early 30s, and I I started to look at things from that perspective. That's when I started to ask people in my family, what's the status of the case right now? And it seemed like it was just kind of like unknown. Like, not that the case wasn't reported, that like nobody could really tell me what was happening. I don't think my family was really being contacted by anybody in law enforcement. So I started to just, do some basic research, like making phone calls and talking to the detective that was assigned to her case, and just trying to get an idea of how missing persons investigations work and how the detectives are assigned to it, and all that jazz.
What year would you say that was, Julian? What year?
2012.
Okay. Very good.
Because at that point, I had asked one of Judy's sisters to send me, I guess she had a folder of all the information she had about Judy's disappearance, or whatever she had, and she mailed it. She sent it to me in the mail, and I just found the folder the other day, because it was October of 2012, and I was like, oh, that's right, I got that package. So that's kind of when it started in October of 2012, and then shortly after I got that job at the Public Defender's Office in March of 2013, and my involvement was very gradual at first, because I didn't really know how to, even though I was an investigator, I didn't know how to navigate the law enforcement side of it.
Yeah.
So I just I kind of just tried to take a back seat. I mean, nobody was in the front seat. But,
that's a good one.
But, I was reluctant, I guess is the best way to put it.
Okay.
And then, over time, I started to become more and more confident, because, I guess to be really straightforward, I started listening to a lot of podcasts, and they taught me, after listening to hundreds and hundreds of different cases, how to try to navigate this whole process. I just started to learn through all these different, accounts of listening to people you interview and other people, and their stories of how they navigated these cases. So I kind of just built a template in my head, and I started to go with it.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Do you think that finding out that you had a cousin that was missing way back in the 1970s maybe subconsciously kind of led you to becoming an investigator eventually, even though you went off on all these tangents, like you said, archaeology and other things? Do you think that was maybe something subconsciously that was pushing you in that direction?
I wish I could say yes, but I didn't even really grow up that interested in true crime or anything like that. It didn't really fascinate me at all as a kid. And then suddenly, as an adult, we all changed various ways. But I went from basically not really much of it. I didn't have an opinion to totally just trying to understand and consume all these different cases, and just so that I could learn as much as I could. And it was really mostly from an investigator's perspective. It wasn't really as somebody just for the sake of it. To me, they were kind of in a way case studies that I could use to somehow apply my own custody.
Sure. Okay.
And it was, I will say, every episode of everything I've ever listened to has been helpful in some way.
Cool. Good. All right, so you've been doing this, I guess, for over 10 years now, but you also have to remember you do this for your everyday work in New York City, too.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So you are one of the few people, I think, who have been on here, who have been on Unfound, who is a private citizen, but his main job is actually investigative work, working for a public defender's office. So, whatever cases you're involved in, you are required to go out and get information that obviously is going to maybe help the defense.
Yeah.
Okay, very, very good. So you're doing this, so that's obviously great on-the-job training.
Yeah, and the thing that really was different between that and this is that I'm used to collecting things that are still here. You know, people that I could go to their house and ring their bell. You know, videos that are still recorded.
Right.
You know, when you go past 77, it's just kind of like, where do I start? You know,
I know the feeling. I and a lot of family members, of course. You know, I've covered disappearances from the 1970s and even older than that. And although these people don't have the investigative experience that you do with everyday work that you do, that they're the same way. You know, you go back to the 1970s. Where do you even start? You know, and you know.
What amazes me about a lot of those families is that they basically become their own private investigators.
Oh yeah, they have to. Yeah, nobody else is going to do it.
They learn how to investigate, especially when they're not satisfied with the investigation that they may or may not be getting, and maybe they can't afford a private investigator. They start doing it themselves, their family.
Yeah.
And you know, I always find it very, you know, admirable and amazing. I was just lucky that was the profession that I happened to really I really enjoy, you know, like the work, and also it was very, you know, like fulfilling work for me.
Sure.
Like I felt like I would, you know, that it was impactful, and you know, so I think at some point, you know, once some of my family members had this case like sort of in their possession for a long time, like it just was passed to me, and it was like, well, you're and I wanted it, you know, I'm an investigator. Like how can I say no?
You can't. That's right. You can't. But we're going to talk a little bit more about more, you know, being that you've been working on this at the end after we cover the rest of this. So we'll come back to talking about you and Judy's family again before we are done with this interview, because we now have to move on to this. We've, of course, talked a lot about Judy, she was going through, 19 years old, having some issues that she thought she needed to get help, and it was probably the right thing to do. But we also have talked about this Richard Riesenberg, who she got to know, and I want to start here. How long did it take, once again, as best as you can tell, going back to the 1970s, how long did it take before somebody put two and two together that Richard and Judith went missing at the same time? Do you have any impressions on that, any insight into that at all?
The newspapers say he went missing on the 21st. It's two different newspapers. I forget which ones.
Okay.
And, you know, originally I had questioned how, if they were reporting, you know, accurately, because at the time I noticed that old papers have a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, they do.
So I took it with a grain of salt, but then when I matched it up with the diary entries and the different documents I found, it seems to be probably the date, if not the exact day, that he, you know, decided not to return to his inpatient facility at Creedmoor. And, you know, and like I said, by the 26th, my family already knew she had run off with him. Mm-hmm. You know, it wasn't even, like, at the time, it wasn't even like, my family wasn't worried, according to what people have told me. They were mad.
Yeah.
Like, you know, they were mad at, like, oh, you know, like, they're doing this eloping thing, but she'll be back in a few weeks. You know, that was kind of the mentality, but they were still mad that she would do something like that, you know. So a lot of my family members were really frustrated with her, but they didn't know a lot.
All right, so, but it's, I guess what we're saying, it's still maybe totally unclear how anybody on the spot knew that these two went missing together. All we know is that Richard's disappearance was noted in the papers, but Judy's was not. You know, at least at the time. No, you know, I guess what I'm saying is if she went missing with Richard on April 21st of 1977, it was written as Richard just disappearing on his own. Judy is not mentioned at all.
There is one article that mentions her.
Oh, it does? Okay.
But I don't know if that's one of the articles that mentions the date that he went missing, because I believe that article was written several months later, but it does confirm that he left with, a younger girlfriend. Like, they didn't even know her name.
Oh, okay. All right. So she's not mentioned, but I guess what they're also saying is he didn't take off alone. All right, now, maybe, of course, as everybody knows, I do quite a bit of marketing out there in Facebook, other places, and setting up episodes before they ever come out. So for a lot of people, they're already going to know where we're going here, but a lot of people aren't. But this is your opportunity now, Joy. I realize Richard's not part of your family or anything, but why don't you tell the listeners who Richard Riesenberg is? Who is he?
Let's see. Richard Riesenberg, at the time Judy was 19 and they were dating, he was 31. And when she went into Creedmoor, he had been in the facility since, she went in August of 76, and he would have been there, I would say, since early 72. So he'd been in there for a number of years, and he was inpatient. Like, he was not outpatient whatsoever. And he had been put in that facility because in January 10th of 1971, he went to work. He worked at JFK Airport, and he comes home, and he finds his wife and his son dead in the apartment. And so, he calls police, and they're investigating and all this and that, but, they start to put things together, and, it turns out, he had killed them at some point, and then went to work, and then came back and pretended like it, like it was like a break-in. And his wife Diane, he brutally stabbed her many times, and his son Andrew, who was 17 months old at the time, he tried to drown him in the bathtub, but that didn't work. So he used the ligature to strangle him. And he killed them both. And soon after, he was arrested and brought to a maximum security facility in upstate New York called Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Facility. And until he was waiting to go to, I guess, court for it. I don't know necessarily trial, because he had I think it was a bench trial when a judge determined.
That's right.
Yeah, so there was like a year in between that period. So they moved him to Creedmoor in Queens because this happened in Queens. He was living in Glen Oaks, Queens, with his wife and his son, and so that was the jurisdiction. So they moved him back to Queens, to Creedmoor, because that was one of the closest facilities to both the courthouse and everything that he had to do legally. So that's when he was transferred to Creedmoor, and eventually he has a bench trial. He has an attorney. I don't think it was a court-appointed attorney. I think he paid for it, and I don't know how many though. Maybe, probably one, but maybe more. I know at least one though, and the judge ruled him, I guess, innocent by way of insanity.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's really shocking, but at the same time, I've read lots of things in the 70s that have around the country that have like a similar philosophy to psychiatry at the time. That there was a lot more insanity pleas going on in the 70s specifically, and he was one of them in 72, and then he was in Creedmoor for just 4 years doing, I guess, doing his thing, and there were no major issues while he was in the facility. Yeah, he did have a couple of like random breakdowns, but the thing that was interesting about him is that when he had this episode, or whatever it was that caused him to kill his wife and son like that. I mean, there are a lot of indicators in his past that it wasn't just like malice. There was something psychological going on there that he was not well.
Right. Hadn't you told me that, I have it in here in my notes, that did he try to commit suicide as a teenager and he wrote a message, and then even after he murdered his wife and child, he wrote like the same message, something like that?
Yes, that's kind of how they put it together, that he was the person that had murdered them, because when he was in his teens, he tried to commit suicide, I want to say like twice, and and usually he was pretty violent about it, but and he wrote, I mean, I don't know if you want me to say this, but but he wrote on the mirror, I don't, well, at his home, I think it was like in soap or something, or lipstick, like, that's to all Jew lovers,
Wow.
And
okay.
His father was Jewish, but his mother was not. She was Catholic, so, he had a lot of Jewish family, on his father's side, and so I don't know what was going on there in terms of like how he viewed like his religious situation, like being like kind of having family members in different
denominations,
beliefs.
Different religions,
Yeah.
faith, sure.
But it was something that you would think that doesn't have anything to that would have much to do with whatever reason he wanted to commit suicide.
Right.
It doesn't really seem like they go together.
No.
But he was having some problems at home, and I've been able to confirm with his family, as a teenager, and he did have outbursts, violent outbursts, but they were never like fatal or as violent as what happened with his wife and his son. But it probably built up over the years, especially if he hadn't been treated.
Yeah.
And I don't think he had ever been treated prior to killing them in 1971. And at the time, he would have been like 25, 26 when he killed his wife and son.
Right. So he tries to cover up the murder that he committed against his wife and son. Tries to say it happened while he was at work. Obviously, eventually investigators see through that. And then his defense team or lawyer, who it's usually, as you know, it's usually more than one. Maybe only one lawyer shows up in court, but usually a lot of people behind the scenes working on it. They come up with the idea of the insanity for defense, which, as you and I have talked about, Julian, here in the 21st century, I just don't know if the public even really takes that kind of defense seriously anymore. That's almost, I think most people who try to do that are found guilty. It's just, no, you're not insane. You knew exactly what you were doing. Whereas it seemed it did work here to the point that not only did he not have to go to jail or anything, but he got put in a facility which wasn't anywhere close to what a jail is. And although it seems maybe in the beginning he had to stay in this facility, but at some point he worked himself up to the fact that he just had a curfew. He could go out and do whatever he wanted as long as he was back by curfew. And this was a guy who killed his wife and son.
Yeah. In the first facility in Mid-Hudson, it's, I think, now referred to as Mattawan, it was like locked down. He couldn't do anything. It was like kind of like a prison. And when they transferred him to Creedmoor, it's like one of those, like, I don't say bureaucratic things, but it's like, nobody's checking to see like how secure this facility is. They're just like, this is where he goes because it's close to the courthouse, and over time, he was a very manipulative person, and he was very different from the other patients in the facility, because when he was not having violent psychotic episode, he was high functioning. Like, he seemed like a regular guy.
Okay.
You know, so he presented like one, and for the most part, he acted like one. That it felt like he couldn't take care of himself and he couldn't function. It's just, stressors and things, and anxiety. I think just he would have like these, I don't know if they're panic attacks or whatever they were, but or just violent psychotic breakdowns. But, and they didn't happen often, but I mean, often enough that nobody wants that,
But I guess what we're saying, what we just want to stay on the topic here, Join, is that at some point, though, it just became the fact that he could come and go from that facility as he wanted, as long as he was back by a certain time every night.
Yeah, my point was that over time, I think he started to gain the trust of the people at the facility because he was manipulative, and he could come and go, and I mean, he would go to see movies, he would go to baseball games. I mean, he would just be able to wander around New York City until his curfew, like as if he were a regular citizen, even though he had committed those, violent murders.
Right.
So,
and we should stay, the listeners should know, the way you know this is you've actually spoken to an employee at the facility who worked there at the time that Richard was there.
Yeah. He and I have become really good friends. I ended up meeting him on Web Sleuths, of all places. He saw that someone had made a post about Judy and Richard, and he wrote something, and then I got in contact with him, and we started talking, and it turns out he became a judge in upstate New York, and we became really good friends, and he's one of the only people that I've ever met that knew Richard during this time period.
Wow.
Because his parents would go visit him in the hospital because they lived 15 minutes from Creedmoor. His sister, she moved away, and so this guy, worked in the same unit that Richard was in. He saw Richard every day at work.
Wow.
And they had to the point where they had multiple long conversations. Because like I said, Richard could have those conversations. He could function to an extent, But,
yeah, we're not going to give him too much leeway here, Julian. I don't know if I don't know if he was psychotic or not. It just sounds to me like he was a guy who couldn't control his temper, but that's what it sounds like to me. But we should say one more thing, though. If everybody's not outraged that he got away, he even tried the insanity defense, and it worked to the point where he was in a facility where he could come and go as he wanted. Tell the listeners what happened to his wife's life insurance money.
Yes, so because he was declared insane at the time, and there are laws that prevent this now, but at the time he was able to collect her life insurance because she died, and since he was innocent, he wasn't responsible, so he was awarded 2/3 of that money, and her family was awarded 1/3 of that money.
That is crazy.
Yeah, and I mean the total amount was equivalent to $75,000 today.
Okay.
But back then it was he got 11,000, and her family got 6.
All right.
And so he had a substantial chunk of money. When he was awarded that money, I have no idea. He didn't have it with him in the hospital, so where did it go?
Right, and that's we'll get into that here in a little bit. So we're going back to when we were talking about Judith and what she was doing for money. Maybe she was getting money from Richard from the life insurance policy that his wife had. Possible.
Yeah.
It is possible. Okay, so for everybody out there, and like Julian said, maybe the laws have changed since then. But we always hear about, a killer can't get the life insurance of a person. If a husband kills the wife, he can't get the life insurance money if he's found guilty. Not necessarily true, which is completely outrageous. Okay. So is this person you've gotten to know very well? He's the person who's given you the circumstances that of, I guess, what we would call Richard's escape. That just one day Richard didn't come back.
Yeah, at that time he had transferred to the unit next door, like the next building. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't seeing Richard as often, but he was told. I'm sure news spread fast throughout the facility because it was a campus that had multiple buildings. It was a very large campus. I mean, now it's all dilapidated and maybe there's one or two buildings there, but at the time there was many buildings. And so he had heard about it. He was like, and he had told me he had reflected on a lot of the conversation that they had had in the past, and he was just like, he actually ran away. What the heck?
Huh. And
so they had conversations about those kind of things over the years.
Right. And this is the reason everybody's wondering why Richard's disappearance was in the newspaper, is because from April 21st of 1977, is because he was locally known for being the murderer of his wife and of his child, and he escaped. That's why it immediately went to the newspaper, because everybody's like, this killer's out on the loose.
Yeah.
Right.
And he's out on the loose. He doesn't come back, and and my cousin goes with him.
Right. Okay. So, but you did tell me though that there could have been some sort of timing because of this, because was Richard's detention, if we can even call that, the detention situation was going to change. You had told me about that. What does that mean?
Yeah. So after a time, once it was brought to the judge's attention and the district attorney's attention that Richard was a little bit able to come and go as he pleased, and once they heard about this, they were obviously disturbed, and they were like, no, this is obviously not working anymore. His case has already been tried, so he can go back to the other facility now. So I mean, I don't even know why he stayed. And now that I think about it, I haven't thought about this until now. I don't even know why he stayed in Greenwood that many years. Mm-hmm. He could have been sent back upstate after the trial, but they were going to send him back to Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Facility, which was locked down, couldn't go nowhere, and somebody must have told him, because nobody was gonna warn him about that ahead of time. So, I'm sure they couldn't just show up one day and just drag him and bring him upstate. They had to arrange it. So, law enforcement must have discussed it with some people in the hospital, and Richard found out somehow. So he he had some time to plan and figure out what he was going to do and where he was going to go.
Right. So this is what we're saying is this disappearance, April 21st of 1977 of him, he might have been the motivating factor in this, because his situation was going to change. He wasn't going to get to come and go. He was going to get locked down again. Granted, it's not technically a jail, but he was going to be losing some of his freedom, and he thought, well, this is the best chance for me to get out of here right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we have to remember he had all that money with him that he surely wasn't spending, because he was living in a facility, being paid by the taxpayers.
Yeah.
All right, so we can think about that. And then, of course, Judy goes missing around the same time. And as you've already stated in earlier, that in one of your family's diaries, by 5 days later, the 26th of April, one of your family members was already writing, yeah, Judith is gone with Richard, right?
Yeah.
So somebody put this together pretty quickly. So let's move on to this. The FBI got involved. They actually went and questioned your family. What do you know about any of that?
Well, let me say this about the 26th. When my family, this is why they were angry. When my family knew she ran off with him, they didn't know about his past, though.
Yeah, right.
They just knew he had been a patient.
Yeah.
And then in mid-May, I don't have an exact date, but somewhere between the 15th and the 18th, the FBI shows up at my grandmother's house and explains the situation. Okay, well, so she went missing, but this is what he was in the facility for. He had killed his wife and his child, and like, the whole situation kind of switched from, like, I can't even really imagine, like,
no, I can't either.
Yeah, like, anger to horror.
Yeah, right.
You know, and
sure.
Not knowing whether or not to what extent Judy knew that, you know, like, that's even more kind of scary, you know. You know, he was at least 11 years older than her to begin with, and, you know, and now, you know, he had somehow convinced her, you know, to go with him.
Right. Suddenly they're worried she might be his third victim.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm still trying to figure out if that's the case to this day. You
yeah.
know,
yeah.
You know, I worry that that's what might have happened. You know.
Right.
But you know, after the FBI came to speak to my family didn't really have much information to give them, and unbelievably, since May of '77, there was law enforcement has not contacted anybody in my family or Richard's family. Like they were investigating, looking for him, but even like, you know, decades later, like they never came back to, like, you know, kind of relook at the investigation or anything like that. And I can't say why, because I've FOIA'd for those files, but I haven't gotten them yet.
Right.
But
right.
At some point, it looks like they kind of moved on, you know.
Mm-hmm. So, being that just maybe something that's going through the audience's mind, he got this money. It doesn't seem like the FBI was able to, you know, track down a bank account that he might have had, you know, get a warrant to check the bank records. No, nothing that you've ever heard of anything like that at the time in '77 or even since?
I'm sure they've tried a number of things, but I'm also pretty sure he was prepared. Like, you know, he probably had a substantial amount of cash on him, so that he didn't have to, you know, interact with any of these banks, you know. And you know, I wasn't around in the '70s, but it's been pointed out to me also that doing things like changing your social or changing your name was a lot easier.
Sure.
And also, you know, taking a drive up to Canada and getting across the border, like, you didn't necessarily even need, like, an ID.
No. A lot easier to do that back then than it is now. In fact, you need a passport to get into Canada now. All right, so they take off. Of course, your family then discovers who Richard really is and become horrified by this. In any of those conversations that the FBI, once again, I realize you were not there, but anybody who's been able to pass this along, did the FBI ever say, well, we think they might have gone to California. We think that they might have gone to Mexico. Did the FBI seem to have any idea at all where they were to even look?
If they did, they never told anybody.
Never said anything.
The only thing I could find is something in one of the papers that said that Creedmoor a couple of months later got a prank. Well, I don't know if it was a prank phone call or actually a phone call from Richard, but saying that he was in California.
Huh.
Ha ha ha. You know. So it could have been a prank. It
could have been him. Maybe. Might have been. I mean, we talk a lot about prank calls and things like that on Unfound, but that might be one in which it might actually be true. Given that you've been working on this for over 10 years now, Julian, have you tried to get the paperwork from the FBI, file a FOIA with the FBI regarding all of this, and let the listeners, and we have some other things to talk about, but why don't you let them know how that has gone in trying to get the paperwork from them?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this, like, you know, I've had the file for 10 years, but I've only really been able to work it, like, I want to say, since, like 2020, you know, like, when I really, like, started calling all, like, I really understood how to navigate everything, you know, so, I don't want to make it seem like I FOIA'd these things, like, 10 years ago, and I still haven't gotten them.
Okay.
I FOIA'd for the FBI files about a year ago, and I actually didn't hear back. It wasn't a yes or, I mean, that's better than a no.
Yeah.
But, you know, I just, you know, I just don't want to hear one of two things. You know, we don't have them, they disappeared, or, you know, it's open and active investigation, and which it obviously isn't.
All right, so just to be clear on this, you have tried to get the files from the FBI, going through official channels, filling out the paperwork, sending it to them, and you just have never heard anything back from them.
No, not yet.
Okay.
I'm gonna just, you know, I guess I'll, you know, keep sending in their application until I at least get an answer.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also able to, you know, like they're in Manhattan, so I mean, one of these days I'm just gonna walk into their office and be like, all right, end the talks.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's probably about that time. If you really did this a year ago, it's probably time to do that. I mean, I will tell you, the listeners may have forgotten about this, but some years ago, I did a FOIA for some paperwork from the FBI. I didn't get it for reasons that I was actually trying to get this paperwork from somebody else, that somebody else had made the information. The FBI collected it, never gave it back, and so I was trying to be the person to get that back, and this person, due to some fear reasons, will not sign off on all of this. But I will tell you this, in my dealings with the FBI, trying to get paperwork from them, they're very cordial and always got back to me very quickly. So you might want to, the people that I dealt with, even though eventually I did not get the paperwork, at least not yet, they always got back to me very promptly. So I think you might want to try that again, very soon.
Yeah. And the reason why I'm doing it actually is, the FBI has his case as a fugitive. Like they don't have Judy as a missing person.
No, right.
So, but the NYPD does have her as a missing person, like cold case, but that wasn't open until like 2010. And my interactions with their missing persons unit, they would be able to FOIA those much easier than I could.
Yeah.
Okay. And I pointed that out to the detective, that is assigned to Judy's case, and he just blows me off, really. He'll yes me to death, but then not do anything. So, I wish I could get to a point where, like this, going into this, I had this my dad is retired in NYPD, so I went into this with a very positive outlook. Like, I'll get all this stuff with my family, I'll put all this stuff together, the circumstantial stuff, and I'll say, here's what I have, everything I have, and it might help you, like, kind of get an idea of where to start, and when I told him I had things to give him, he wasn't really interested.
No. Okay, that's common. That's unfortunately common. Okay,
yeah.
Let's move, Julian. Let's move on to this. Now, Judy, though, did make a phone call to her family in Kansas at some point, maybe even after the disappearance date. When was it made, and what did she say? What is this?
Okay, she made a call to her sister in New York, the only one of her immediate family that was still in New York after her family left. And that was the sister who went to the facility to meet Richard for the first time. And, she called her and just said, it was a few weeks later, she couldn't give me an exact date, but she said, like 3-4 weeks, a couple of weeks. And she said, and for a long time, I was trying to figure out, like, what was said on this call, and if anything, could I get anything out of it? But basically, all Judy said is, like, I'm okay, don't worry about me, I'm okay, and, her sister tried to figure out where she was, tell me where you are, or what's going on, and, Judy just ended the call very quickly,
Okay.
That was only a few weeks later, it wasn't, and since then there's been
Nothing.
Nothing.
Okay.
Nothing.
Now, you have had a chance, of course, you've talked to a bunch of people in your family. In fact, you've talked to a person who worked at the facility, tracking this person down, which I think is spectacular. But you actually have gotten to speak to the sister of Richard Riesenberg, and actually quite recently, we don't have to get into her name or anything, but what did she say about back then, when she found out that her brother went missing? Let's get the other side of this now, from the Riesenberg side of things. What has the sister told you?
The sister, she went into social work, and she had just, when he had killed his family in 1971, she had just graduated and was moving to Massachusetts anyway. So she was kind of distancing herself from the situation, because obviously very, very disturbing, not the kind of family dynamic that you want, around. And so, when I called her, she was very helpful, and she was very kind, and, it took me a while to kind of muster up the courage to call her, because, I didn't know, how it would go,
Right, you never know. It's true.
Yeah, and so she was very helpful, and she just said, at the time, I moved away as fast as I could, and I would go visit my parents, but I stayed away because I wanted nothing to do with him. Like, it was, she was basically telling me it was difficult enough growing up with him, but then after he killed Diane and Andrew, that was the final straw. She was done,
Mm-hmm.
and she moved to Massachusetts, and I think has been there for since then, and because that's where she still is now. And she had said to me that when he went missing, she had stressed to her parents, do not tell him where I live. If you hear from him, if you see him, do not tell him where I live. By no means, I do not want him coming up here and appearing at my door. Like, she was just horrified and afraid, and just didn't want him around, And his parents, understandably, I think, tried to deal with it as best as they could. I think the dad was, a little bit more like, this is still my son, so, he would visit him in the hospital a lot, and the mother was kind of torn, she was devastated, but at the same time, she wasn't cutting off contact completely, and, so I think it made things complicated for their family at the time.
Yeah.
Everyone had different feelings about it, and and then Linda just his sister just decided that she was going to live her own life and not worry about that, and not to fast forward a little bit, but eventually when her mother was ill, she moved with her to Massachusetts, and when she passed, she did not even put her mother's obituary out there because she didn't want to risk Richard showing up.
Wow.
I mean, that's how.
Right.
She just wanted nothing to do with him, and who could blame her?
Right. She might be. Yeah. Who knows? Yeah. You just have a brother who is a killer and killed the two people that are supposed to be most important in his life. Who knows who he might kill next? Right?
Yeah.
And of course that's the fear with Judy. Being Judy's still missing. That's the fear with that as well.
Yeah. Is that, given the stressors of the situation, like running from the FBI, being a fugitive, having to figure out where to live, like all those factors, I don't think it would have been very good for his mental health.
Right.
In terms of being able to handle that pressure and.
Right.
And I had been able to see initially my thoughts were that, also, what about his medication? Like, suddenly he stops taking it and he's running around.
But
I found out that he was not on medication at the time, so there would have been no withdrawal or side effects or anything that would have happened as a result.
Right, and which goes back to my idea that I'm not sure this guy had any psychology or psychological problems at all. I think he was just a guy who couldn't handle his temper, and when things didn't go the way he wanted, he killed people. That's not a psychological condition. That's just a bad person. So, being that he wasn't on any medication, some years after he killed his wife and son, would tell me that maybe he didn't have an issue at all, and he pulled off this a little magic act in court, and with his lawyer's help, I guess. Let me ask you this: in speaking to his sister, did she ever say maybe she thought that Richard might be in her life, maybe just secret? Did she ever feel like somebody might be following her? Did she ever get any weird phone call hang-ups and things like that? Anything like that ever come up when you spoke to her?
Not her. But she had told me that at some point, a number of years later, I want to say late 94, early 95, she got a call from her mother, and her mother said to her, Richard's attorney just called me and said that she got a call that he got a call from him, and something about him thinking about coming back to New York, and
wow.
And sister was a little bit, she wasn't very happy to hear that, but he ended up not coming back anyway. But she remembers that being around the 94, 95 period. She said because of things that were going on at the time, So I mean, he may have called them his attorney at that point, and expressed some interest in what would happen if I came back legally, and and to pass a message along to his mother, because I would imagine there's a high level of paranoia of if the FBI's looking for you,
right? Of course.
And at that time in the 90s, I mean, there, I think it was Star 69 at the time.
Right, right. So what we're saying is, all right, so and that's gonna lead us right into talking about Richard's lawyer, because you just tried calling him recently. But what we're saying here, seemingly, that 18 years after Judy and Richard disappeared seemingly together in April of 1977, sometime around the OJ stuff, which was 94, 95, Richard actually called the lawyer that he had way back in the 1970s.
Yeah, and then eventually he had said to the attorney, he had decided, because of the publicity of the OJ trial and how, I guess him watching it, he was like, people aren't very, really know how he put it, but his viewpoint was kind of people aren't very forgiving, if you do those kind of things, obviously. So, I don't think it's a good idea to come back,
Okay.
And that's what kind of spooked him, and that's why, his sister had remembered that it was that period of time, because, she had something to reference. But when I tried to call, I found out that his attorney is still alive.
Yeah. Tell the listeners, you contacted him, and what happened?
I contacted him, and I didn't even really get to interview him. He kind of just hung up on me very, very quickly. He just said, "No, thank you," click, and I called back the second time immediately, because generally, if you hang up on a telemarketer, they're not really allowed to call you multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to let him know I wasn't one, and then I sent him a short text message basically saying here's why I'm calling, without divulging everything. But he never got back to me, so I asked another one of my allies in the investigative true crime community, could you try this out for me? And one thing that we like to do sometimes is like, if they don't want to talk to a man, maybe they want to talk to a woman, And so she tried, and he was nice as pie to her.
Wow. Okay, well that's nice. Now we should make something clear though for the listeners. When you called him, you never even got to say the name Richard Riesenberg, correct? No. So we have to understand that the reason that he hung up on you is not necessarily because you mentioned Richard Riesenberg. You didn't want to talk about that. He just hung up on you for whatever reason. Yeah, I mean, I just still thought it was strange that when I tried to call back again, and I also texted more detail. He still didn't try to reach out to me like this. I figured if he cared to talk about it, like, he would have just called me back and been like, "Oh, sorry, I thought you were a telemarketer," or something like that. But, all right, so let's move on to, so your friend though called him and they did talk. What was the conversation? Basically he didn't really have much that he had to say or remembered about it. Like, he said he remembers getting a call at some point from Richard saying all the stuff that he wanted to come back, but he didn't have a time frame for it. I mean, he's 84 now, and this was 30 years ago. 30 years, about 30 years ago. So I mean, supposedly 30 years ago. So he wasn't sure if it happened closer to 77 or 94. He had no clue. Okay. So at this point, I'm hoping maybe he has some records and he'll get back to my friend. Like, maybe he wrote it down somewhere, in his diary. Right, and so what we're saying here is, really, we're just going by Richard's mother, who then contacted his sister saying that that's the way she remembered it. Of course, Richard's mother is deceased now, but at the time, the way the sister remembers it, it was in that 1994-95 time frame, somewhere in there. Yeah, and, I would imagine that this would stick out in her mind very vividly because she was very afraid of him. I agree with you. And for good reason, and that happened just very, very recently, a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. And so learning that was a possibility really changed a lot of how I viewed this case. Because previously, if I had told you like what my opinion was of what happened, like, or what I think might have happened, it's very different now. Okay. And being that we're talking about just a few weeks ago, the listeners should know we're doing this interview on March 5th of 2023. When your friend did get to talk to this lawyer, did the lawyer ever say what, deprivileged, but did he ever tell Richard, hey, Richard, you shouldn't have run away in the first place? Or did he advise Richard to come back and face justice? Did the two of them even get into that in the conversation or not? The only thing that they communicated that he had said to Richard is like, "Don't tell me where you are because I'm like basically sort of obligated to report it. So just don't give me any information. I don't want to know anything. Just ask me what you want to ask me, and then okay. Go do what you got." All right, because once again, even though there's privilege, there is certainly not privilege if it's taking part in a crime. And if a lawyer happens to know where the client is and the client is on the run from the law, then that could get into the lawyer, he himself or herself could get into some legal issues. So that's why a lawyer would say something like that. I get that. Now, interestingly, if we want to talk about this, you actually called the lawyer. When the lawyer hung up on you, you actually called the lawyer's son. And how did that go? I called the lawyer's son in Colorado, who also is an attorney. And he actually heard, he let me talk for like a minute. He heard my whole thing about missing in and this, and it happened in 77, and and I was basically asking him, is there any way that maybe you can appeal to your father to speak to me, and his only response was, well, I was born in 66, so I was 11 in 77, so
sorry. And he hung up on me.
Okay. All right, so you got hung up twice by two people in the same family. Okay. All right.
In the same 15-minute span.
Yeah, in 15 minutes. That's the way to get it done, Julian. All right, so you're working on this, and of course these conversations were just recently. Let's move on to this. So this is that's Richard Riesenberg. So we talked about Judy, and we talked about the guy that she seemingly went, I guess, on the run with, and there's been no sign of them since. And so, if we're to believe this lawyer, it seems at least Richard was alive 18 years after they went on the run. But I'm also guessing then, Julian, during that conversation, that Judy's name never came up when the two of them talked in 1994 or 95.
It never came up, but it came up that he was with someone.
Yeah.
A woman. But he didn't say who.
Okay.
I was just hoping at least when I was talking to when my friend was talking to the attorney, that he at least knew or remembered, like, who was he with, but he didn't even recall that there was a girl that went missing with him.
Mm-hmm.
So that was...
Yeah. It certainly would be nice, Julian, if now that the lawyer knows what these calls were for, it'd be nice if, being that you're the one who's been working on this, that you could call him back and have a deeper conversation. I'm hoping that can happen.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to. I wouldn't, but I wouldn't be surprised based on what he said already that he doesn't really have much to help me with.
Okay.
Unless he had documents, then that might be helpful. Just to say, oh, okay, it's around or about this date. But one thing I wanted to say about what we were talking about with attorney-client privilege, but also not being able to aid them in the commission of a crime, even though Richard didn't say where he was, I mean, I would imagine that the attorney was obligated to call, the authorities to let them know that he got a call from this man.
You'd think. Yeah, you'd think.
18 years before.
Right, you'd hope.
I don't know if that ever happened. He may have done that, but and that maybe in the files somewhere, but I don't know if he ever did that, and he didn't indicate that he remembered doing that. So
right, and we also might visualize, depending on how badly the FBI wanted to track down Richard Riesenberg, they might have gotten a phone tap for the lawyer's phone back in '77, and Richard might have waited all these years thinking, well, surely his phone's not tapped at this point. I mean, we might be open to that as well. That might have been legal back then.
Yeah, actually, I think that's why he did call the attorney and not his mother, for instance.
Yeah.
Because my family has said that they think they had their phones tapped at some point because it was a little more obvious back then. Like, when your phone was tapped, there would be that, that clicking. And that was going on for a while. And I would imagine they did the same to his family if they had tapped some of my family's phones.
Yeah.
And, it seems like, Richard had enough forethought to be like, well, it's probably not a good idea if I call any of them. So, if I call the attorney and he decides he's going to tell somebody still, it's going to be a little bit harder to, get to the attorney's phone records, than my mom's, so, he still was, if that call happened, he was still operating from a very cautious place.
Yeah, he's going to be cautious. Now, we should say one more thing. Your understanding was that Richard and his father were close. The mother and the sister, it seems like, once he ended up killing his wife and child, kind of distanced themselves, but the father still kind of remained close to Richard?
The father did. I was told by the orderly that worked at Creedmoor that knew Richard that the father would come visit, multiple times a week. I mean, their house was like about a 15-minute drive from the hospital that he was staying at. So it was close by, just by coincidence, actually. But and the mother the mother, she did try to participate, but I think she was torn. She was somewhere in between, like the sister and the dad. Whereas the sister was just like no. But
right.
But I think ultimately unfortunately, the dad was there often, so if, when we were talking about the money before, if anybody, held on to the money for him, which wasn't illegal, it would have been his dad.
Yeah, it could have been his father, right? That's right.
And, and if he wanted, money to go out and do things, he obviously couldn't go to a bank himself, but, maybe he could while he was in the hospital. I don't think he had a bank account, but.
Yeah, the money still seems to be the best. Of course, it's almost 50 years now, but the money angle, this still seems to be maybe the best choice. Even all these years later, that money. I don't really believe that he, if he got however much money was, he got it all in cash and was lugging it all around. I mean, that this seems a little outrageous to me. But okay, let's move on to this. How has your family thought about you taking this on, Julian?
They've all thanked me. I haven't had anybody really say anything, negative to me or not want me to.
Yeah.
It has been pointed out to me more than once, and I have thought about this in a sense, that no matter what happened, if I find out the truth of what happened between them, whether or not Judy's alive still or she's not, it's not a happy ending, because, and I never had thought about that previously, in the sense that, if she had willingly just, left for all this time, I mean, that kind of stinks.
Right, that's right. Right. In fact, we're not even sure that Judith even knew that Richard had killed 2 people, right? We don't even know she knew that.
Yeah, we're not, we're not, I don't even know to what extent. I mean, she had to know he was in the hospital for some reason, but, how he could keep that a secret the whole time, I don't know, so. And I doubt she was going back to archives in 71 for newspapers.
No, probably not. But on the other hand, not to take this, but we on the other hand know about women who become fascinated with men on death row and end up marrying them too. So, maybe even if she knew, I'm not here to speak poorly of her, but we know this is a thing as well. Women becoming infatuated with men who are in jail. I don't know why that is, but it certainly does exist. Does your family have DNA in a database like NAMUS or something in case remains were happen to be found somewhere?
Yep. My family and his family.
Okay.
I didn't know that his sister had done that. But we've opted into GenMatch. The DNA from my side of the family, has been submitted to NAMUS because Judy's has her own NAMUS profile. Richard obviously doesn't because he's a fugitive, but so yeah, we have our DNA with both really, and there's never been any hits or anything.
Okay. We have to remember that Judith was 19 in 77, Richard was 31, so she would be 65, and he would be 77 now.
Yeah.
So it's been a while. I guess statistically, he'd be a little older than the average male, average lifespan of a male in the United States. She would still be well under it. So maybe everybody has to figure that into their calculations as to whether Richard and Judy are still alive or they're both deceased, or what has happened there. And as Julian has already stated earlier, we have to remember this 1970s may be easier for somebody to change his or her ID back then and everything than it would be here in the 21st century. Julian, do you have a Facebook page or anything like that set up for the work that you're doing regarding the disappearance of your cousin, Judy Brown?
Yes, I do. It's called Judith Anne Brown Missing, Vanished with a Killer.
Wow. Okay. And so I guess you are the one that manages it. You're the administrator?
Yep.
Okay, excellent.
I have some other people that help me administrate it, but I make all the posts and and I had, I started making Instagram and other things attached to it that I can get as social media as possible,
Okay. Julian, any final words before we complete this interview?
No, I don't. I can't really. We've talked about a lot. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I know what I want to say is that, it's for a long time. And you should know, the listeners should know that Julian first came to me. This was not a disappearance, even if I had never even heard of Richard Riesenberg, even though he's a killer. I'd never heard of him before, but certainly have read a lot about him now. But maybe, Julian, you don't know this, but for a long time, there is a particular type of disappearance that Unfound is not covered, and I always made a point of bringing it up, and that was the fugitive. Now, I realize Richard is not your family member, and we're here to talk about Judith. She is the innocent one in all of this. But Richard Riesenberg is the first disappearance that we've covered where the person is actually what we would out and out call a fugitive from justice. Although we've covered disappearances of people who had warrants out for their arrest and everything, this is certainly a little bit different than that. So this is this has been a long time coming, given that we've covered 280 some disappearances on Unfound, Julian. And so I hope you will keep me apprised as you continue to work on this. It sounds like you've made a lot of progress in the time you've been working on it.
And that I think part of the advantage I have that they're both linked and they're both missing is that working on either side of their case will sort of lead me to one or the other.
Yeah.
In some sense, unless they parted at some point. So that's why I can kind of work it from both angles. And I was going to say that I've been networking a lot with lots of people in the true crime community, and there've been a lot of people who just volunteered to help me with various things. People such as yourself that who wanted to talk about this story. And, prior to 2021, prior to 2022, there was no media for my cousin ever. When I tried to figure out if the NYPD had anything in their files about my cousin's missing person case, I can't find any evidence that they have anything, because whenever I've called them, in the past, I've been asked, well, what's her social again? So it didn't leave me with much hope for that, but so I've been building on it for some time, but it's like a lot of families are sure have expressed to you, it's a long and drawn out process, and you have to be so patient, and I can't imagine, being directly connected to the situation and it just happening, recently, and trying to navigate all this at the same time, because right now, I'm essentially working. I mean, I had some friends help me with some things, but I'm doing everything myself.
Sure.
And it's hard because I'm not good at everything. For instance, social media, I had to go back and refresh myself on how to make all these things.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not a very heavy social media user, so
Well, Julian, I appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound.
Thanks, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And that was my March 5th, 2023 interview with Julian Quaterio, cousin of Judy Brown. I thank him for joining me and all of you on this episode. On Unfound's website, theunfoundpodcast.com, I've posted some articles from the early 1970s regarding Richard's murders of his wife and child. I've also posted an article on how the state of New York eventually changed its laws concerning killers being held at mental health facilities. The article specifically mentions Richard as an example of why the law was changed. Lastly, I've posted a recent letter from the FBI sent to Julian on their attitude toward Richard Riesenberg in 2023. It is interesting. So, what to think about this first of its kind disappearance or disappearances on Unfound? Everybody's first concern should be for Judy. Given that I don't think she was the one who came up with the idea of taking off, we might contemplate whether she willingly went with Richard or got abducted. However, my opinion is that it really doesn't matter. What matters is Richard was a killer, is a killer if he is still alive. And people who kill are the ones who are most likely to kill again. Furthermore, we know that Judy never contacted anybody after April 1977. This could feed into the idea that Richard harmed her. What raises the risk of this outcome is Richard's previous victims weren't a business partner or drinking buddies. He killed his wife and child. Two victims who would be in the same category as Judy. However, maybe we need to look at this the opposite way. If Richard really did contact his lawyer in 1995 or whenever around that time about coming back to his real life, would he have really done that if he murdered Judy? Because Richard would have to know the very first question he would be asked upon reappearing is, "Where's Judy Brown?" In fact, maybe we need to be hopeful of this thought. Maybe Judy started her own life away from Richard. Maybe she escaped the killer. If you'd like to read and hear more of what I think about the disappearance of Judy Brown and most of Unfound's disappearances, please sign up at patreon.com/Unfound Podcast and start partaking in the Unfound blog. Until then, I leave the public theorizing up to you. And that's the program. Right now, while you are in your podcast platform, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, wherever, give Unfound a 5-star review, a thumbs up, whatever that platform allows. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've just finished this episode of Unfound.